candlelight flickers gently across old wooden beams, the hush of night settling over Tudor England. Imagine the distant toll of church bells, the whisper of silken gowns, and the quiet footsteps echoing through stone corridors as households prepare for the duties and dreams of marriage. Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's journey through time. In the Tudor world, marriage was far more than love. It was duty, survival, and sometimes a dangerous gamble. We'll uncover why brides were sometimes little more than children, how alliances shaped kingdoms, and which secret customs might surprise you even today. So, settle back, let your thoughts drift with history's quiet tide, and allow the past to keep you company as you rest. If you'd like more of these peaceful history wanderings, you're always welcome to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? The world of Tudor England often feels distant, wrapped in shadows of candlelight and whispers of courtly halls, yet if we lean in gently, we can almost hear the soft rustle of gowns across stone floors and the measured footsteps of kings, queens, and courtiers. In that age, marriage was rarely only a private matter of hearts meeting in quiet affection. It was a stage upon which kingdoms moved like players in a slow and deliberate play, where vows spoken in chapels carried the weight not just of love, but of entire nations. To understand these unions, we must first imagine the Tudor world itself. The 16th century was a time of fragile power, when England stood neither as vast nor as secure as it would become in later centuries. Borders were restless, alliances uncertain, and every throne felt the cold breath of rivalry. Within such a landscape, a marriage was far more than two people choosing to share their lives. It was a thread woven into a larger tapestry, binding families, sealing truces, and at times even preventing wars. Kings and queens did not simply fall in love, they were expected to marry with calculation, their hearts often secondary to the needs of their crowns. A daughter could be promised to a distant prince, a smile carrying the hope of peace between nations. A son might be bound to a noble family, strengthening ties that would secure loyalty at court. These unions were spoken of in the language of diplomacy, yet beneath the formalities, there were human lives shaped and steered by forces greater than themselves. One can picture the great halls where such decisions were whispered into being. Long oak tables polished by candlelight, maps unfurled across their surfaces, and advisers leaning in with careful voices. If the princess weds the French king's son, the threat of war may ease. If the prince takes a Spanish bride, new trade may flow across the seas. In this way, a wedding dress was not only a garment of silk, it was the fabric of political strategy. The most famous of these alliances was perhaps the marriage of Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, to Philip of Spain. Though history remembers Mary for many things, her union with Philip was never simply personal. It was a bond meant to unite two kingdoms, to strengthen Catholic power in a Protestant age, and to remind England that its queen stood not alone, but backed by the might of Europe. For Mary herself, the marriage brought little joy, yet for those who watched from afar, it was a symbol of politics clothed in ceremony. Even outside the royal family, noble houses practiced the same strategy. A wealthy earl might give his daughter in marriage to a neighbouring family, ensuring that lands were joined and disputes softened. For the young bride, the arrangement meant leaving behind familiar rooms, stepping into halls that smelled of different fires, and learning the names of new servants, all because her union was a bridge between families. To modern eyes, such arrangements may seem cold, as though affection were absent from the lives of those who entered into them. Yet in Tudor England, duty and affection were not always in opposition. Some couples, bound first by alliance, grew to care deeply for one another, their love blossoming slowly after vows were taken. Others carried the weight of distance, sharing little more than the formal courtesies demanded of them. Both outcomes were accepted, for in the Tudor view, marriage's higher purpose was to hold society steady. And so, as the candlelight flickered against stone walls and choirs sang softly in echoing chapels, marriage became the quiet machinery of power. Behind each union was a hope, a strategy, a dream of peace or prosperity. It is here, in these hushed alliances, that the story of Tudor marriage begins, not with stolen glances or gentle letters, but with kingdoms looking across borders and deciding that the surest bond was a hand in marriage. If marriage in Tudor England was the stitching together of kingdoms, then property was the fabric upon which those stitches were sewn. Land, houses, titles, and wealth were not merely possessions, they were the very measure of power. To marry was to exchange more than vows. It was to decide the fate of estates, to determine who would walk the halls of ancestral manors, and to secure bloodlines that could endure for generations. In that age, England was still very much a land of soil and stone. Vast estates defined the influence of noble families, and farmland determined the prosperity of common folk. Property did not simply sit quietly in the background. It shaped the decisions of fathers and the futures of daughters. A single stretch of meadow, a manor on a hill, or a cluster of villages could change the standing of a family for centuries to come. Thus, marriage became the means by which property was transferred, preserved, or expanded. When a noble family considered a match, they did not ask first about love or temperament, but about inheritance. Who owned what? What would the bride bring into the union? What would the groom's family gain? In these questions, a young woman's dowry, the wealth or land she carried into marriage, became a decisive factor. A daughter was often seen less as an individual and more as a link, a way of binding two estates together so that no piece of land would be lost to rivals. The rules of inheritance often made this even more pressing. Under the system of primogeniture, the eldest son inherited the bulk of his father's estate, while younger sons were left to find their fortunes through the church, the military, or marriage into wealthy families. For daughters, the story was different still. They rarely inherited lands outright unless there were no surviving brothers, and so their marriages became their family's way of securing influence in another household. Property, in this sense, travelled with them like a silent dowry, an invisible weight carried behind their veils. One can imagine the quiet tension at family tables, where discussions of betrothal were whispered with an eye not only to the groom's character, but to his estates. Perhaps a father would remark on the rolling fields that would come into his family's orbit if his daughter wed a neighbouring heir. Perhaps a mother would calculate the household accounts, considering how much wealth might flow into the coffers once the match was sealed. Behind every gentle smile there was often a ledger being balanced, and yet property brought conflict as easily as it brought security. Disputes over inheritance could tear families apart, drawing brothers into feuds and dragging daughters into marriages that were more about settling claims than forging companionship. Legal documents, heavy with seals and signatures, became as binding as the words spoken in church. The Tudors understood well that marriage was as much a contract as it was a covenant. Still, beneath this practical layer there were moments of tenderness. A bride walking through her new estate for the first time might run her hands along the stone walls, wondering what kind of a life awaited her there. A groom, though chosen as much for his wealth as his worth, might look upon his bride and see not just the dowry she carried, but the shared future they were about to build. Property and inheritance were heavy matters, but within them lived small human hopes of stability, of comfort, of a home that might in time become a place of affection as well as strategy. Thus, as we drift further into the world of Tudor marriage, we find that behind the grandeur of political alliances lay these quieter negotiations, the careful passing of lands, the protection of family names, the weaving together of estates. It was not love that most often decided the match, nor even ambition alone, but the slow, steady pull of inheritance. In those dimly lit halls where parchment and candlelight guided the hands of fathers, the future of entire families was mapped not in poetry, but in acres and stone. In Tudor England, the weight of marriage did not rest solely on the shoulders of families or the fortunes of estates. Beyond the private chambers of negotiation, beyond the parchment contracts and whispered alliances, lay an even greater truth. Marriage was seen as a duty, not simply to kin or crown, but to the very fabric of society. To live in that world was to breathe within a tightly woven web of expectations. Every man and woman was born into a role, and from the moment of their earliest years, the rhythm of their lives beat steadily toward marriage. For nobles, it was expected to secure power and wealth. For merchants, it was to strengthen trade and ensure prosperity. For peasants, it was to build households strong enough to weather the seasons and raise the next generation. In each layer of society, marriage was not a choice to be weighed lightly, but a responsibility. a thread each person was bound to contribute to the communal cloth. The Tudor Church echoed this belief in solemn tones. Sermons spoke of marriage as holy, ordained by God not only to temper desire but to ensure that children were born within proper households, cared for and raised to serve their communities. A man without a wife was often seen as incomplete, while a woman without a husband was viewed as vulnerable, adrift without the anchor of duty fulfilled. Marriage was therefore not only personal but moral, a sign that one had taken up the role expected of them in the great order of the world. We might picture a quiet village in the English countryside where marriages were celebrated not only by families but by neighbours and friends. The ringing of church bells signalled not just the union of two individuals, but the strengthening of the whole community. The baker, the blacksmith, the farmers who gathered in fields, each felt in some subtle way steadier knowing that another household had been formed, another hearth kindled, another promise made to carry life forward. For the noble classes, this sense of duty stretched far beyond the parish and the village. A marriage could uphold the stability of the kingdom itself. To refuse the path laid before them, to remain single when alliances or heirs were needed, was not merely a private decision. It was to fail in duty to society, to upset the careful balance upon which peace and order rested. A prince or princess who hesitated could face pressure, persuasion, even the anger of their subjects. In the Tudor mind, to marry was not indulgence, it was responsibility in its highest form, and yet beneath this weight there were individuals who carried their duty quietly, even tenderly. A farmer sowing his fields beside his wife may not have spoken in lofty words of society or duty, but he knew that his union ensured food for his children, security for his land, and stability for his village. A noblewoman walking the long corridors of her husband's estate may not have thought herself a guardian of kingdoms, yet her presence there, her airs and her influence, were threads woven into a far larger tapestry. Marriage as a duty was not free of hardship. Some were bound to partners they did not choose, pressed into unions for reasons beyond their desires. Others lived under the constant reminder that their worth was measured by the household they formed, the heirs they produced, the alliances they upheld. And yet, for many, duty and companionship could find harmony. Some couples, entering their unions with the gravity of obligation, discovered along the way a gentler bond, a shared life that gave sweetness to their duty. So, as the Tudor world spun onward, through its courts and its villages, its feasts and its famines, marriage stood as a pillar, steady and immovable. To marry was not only to share a home, but to uphold an expectation that touched everyone around them. And in that steady, unyielding rhythm, society found its order, its continuity, and its sense of peace. If marriage was a duty to society, then it was often the parents who carried the heaviest hand in deciding how that duty would be fulfilled. In Tudor England, the lives of sons and daughters rarely belonged to themselves, for the path of marriage was steered more by family ambition than by private longing. The hearth and the family name stretched outward into the future, and parents, as guardians of both, felt it their right, and indeed their responsibility, to choose the matches that would secure it. One must imagine the quiet authority of the Tudor household. Fathers, often stern and practical, viewed marriage as an extension of their stewardship over land and kin. To them, a child's union was not a romantic question, but a calculated one. What alliances could be formed? What wealth could be secured? What disputes could be eased with the promise of a daughter's hand? Mothers, too, played their part, sometimes whispering counsel, sometimes urging in softer but no less persuasive tones. Their eyes might rest on the social graces of a potential groom, or the respectability of a future daughter-in-law, knowing well how reputation lingered in every corner of Tudor society. For noble families, this control was at its most commanding. A young woman born into the peerage could find her life charted before she even reached her teens. Promised to the heir of a neighbouring estate or even a foreign prince, her destiny was sealed in letters exchanged between fathers, sealed with wax long before she'd even glimpsed the face of her intended. Sons, though sometimes freer, were also bound by expectation. The eldest was often compelled to wed where the greatest advantage lay, his personal desires trailing quietly behind the needs of inheritance and alliance. Even among the middle classes and common folk, parental control remained strong. In villages and towns, a father might insist his daughter wed a man of steady work, ensuring her survival and the security of grandchildren yet unborn. A mother might discourage her son from marrying for affection if the bride brought little dowry or no useful connections. The belief was simple. The wisdom of parents, shaped by years of managing households and surviving life's hardships, outweighed the fleeting passions of youth. Yet within this control there was room for quiet negotiation. Children, especially daughters, sometimes found subtle ways to express preference. A whispered word here, a gentle plea there, might sway a decision, though not always. Stories linger of couples who won their parents' blessing after patient persuasion, but also of others who were denied, their affections silenced in the name of duty. It is easy to imagine the conflicting emotions of those caught within this system. A young bride might walk to the altar with hands trembling, knowing her parents had chosen for her, carrying both gratitude for their guidance and sorrow for the loss of her own choice. A son, standing beside. His bride might accept his father's will while wondering quietly what it might have been to marry for love. And yet, the Tudor mind often found comfort in obedience. To defy one's parents was not only to risk disinheritance or scandal, but to upset the natural order of things, which placed authority firmly in the hands of elders. Still, there were exceptions. Moments when the heart pressed too strongly against the boundaries of parental command. Secret meetings, stolen glances, and even elopements did occur, though they carried the risk of disgrace. These stories, rare though they were, remind us that human longing never disappeared, even beneath the heavy cloak of family duty. Thus, in Tudor England, the control of parents over matches was not merely custom but expectation, a thread binding individual lives to the larger fabric of society. Every choice was measured, every promise weighed, not only for the happiness of two people, but for the endurance of families, the preservation of names, and the quiet hope that the wisdom of elders would guide the young toward a future secure and steady. From the moment we step into the world of Tudor marriage, it becomes clear that choice was a delicate thing, sometimes present, sometimes absent, and often existing only in the shadows of parental will. Most unions were arranged, their roots planted in the soil of duty and advantage. Yet there were also whispers of mutual choice, moments when affection stirred strongly enough to shape a match, weaving human feeling into the fabric of strategy. Between these two paths, arrangement and choice, lay the lived reality of countless Tudor couples. Arranged marriages were the norm, particularly among the nobility. To arrange was to secure order, to ensure that property, inheritance, and alliances aligned neatly, as if each family were placing careful stones into the foundations of society. A daughter might be promised to a groom she scarcely knew. The negotiations settled between fathers while she was still a child. For her, the future arrived not as a blossoming of romance, but as a name spoken at the dinner table, a contract signed in ink and sealed with wax. Yet arranged unions did not always mean cold or loveless households. Some couples, though brought together by calculation, grew into companionship, learning one another's habits, sharing quiet laughter in the rhythm of daily life. Affection, in this world, often followed rather than preceded the vows. It blossomed slowly, like ivy along stone walls, winding its way upward in time. Still, the absence of choice could weigh heavily. Imagine the gentle sorrow of a young man whose heart had already leaned toward another, only to be guided elsewhere by the will of his family, or the quiet resignation of a bride who walked to the altar with a smile, though her thoughts lingered on a face she would never see again. These stories remind us that the human heart, even under the stern gaze of parents and society, still carried its own longings. Among the common folk, where estates were smaller and wealth less complicated, there was more space for mutual choice. A farmer's son might win his bride through steady courtship, proving his worth not by inheritance, but by the strength of his labour. A merchant's daughter might have a say in her match if her parents trusted her judgment, weighing love alongside practical needs. In these households, affection and arrangement often braided together, neither entirely free nor entirely bound, but balanced in a way that felt closer to companionship. Mutual choice was not unheard of even in noble circles, though it was rarer. Some parents, recognizing the temperament or desires of their children, allowed preference to guide the final decision. A prince might insist on a particular bride, or a nobleman's charm might win approval where political advantage alone could not. In such moments, the weight of duty softened, and personal affection slipped quietly into the narrative of marriage. Yet the very idea of choice in the Tudor age must be held gently, for it was never absolute. A young man or woman could express their wishes, but their voices were woven into a larger chorus of family, property, and politics. Even when affection played its part, it was seldom unaccompanied by practical considerations. Love alone rarely decided the match. It was love and duty walking side by side, one leading, the other following. The balance between arrangement and choice tells us something important about Tudor life, that people were both bound and free, both limited and capable of shaping their destinies. For some, love grew out of arrangement. For others, arrangement bent just enough to allow love its place. And in this delicate dance, society maintained its order, families secured their futures, and individuals found, whether in joy or in resignation, their place within the grand tapestry of their age. In Tudor England, a marriage was never just a union of two souls. It was a mirror held up to an entire family. Every choice, every match, every whispered promise was measured not only against wealth and inheritance, but against that invisible treasure more fragile than land or coin: honour. Reputation in that age was as delicate as glass, and as enduring as stone, shaping how families were seen in their villages, their courts, and even in the chronicles of history. Honour was the currency that flowed alongside gold. For noble families, the worth of a name could rise or fall with a single marriage. A poorly chosen union, a daughter wedded beneath her station, or a son allied to a family of doubtful loyalty, could cast shadows over generations. Thus, parents looked carefully not only at estates and alliances, but at the reputation of the household into which their child would step. Was the family known for loyalty to the crown? Were they respected by neighbours? Were there whispers of scandal? Such questions carried as much weight as questions of dowry or land. Reputation was not only a matter of nobility. In towns and villages, where gossip passed swiftly along narrow streets, a family's standing could be shaped by the character of its children's marriages. A daughter who married into a hard-working household lifted her parents' name. A son who joined himself to a family marked by idleness or dishonour could bring shame that lingered for decades. In a world where community was close-knit and memory long, the choices made at the altar echoed far beyond the church doors. One can picture the hushed conversations in Tudor homes, fathers speaking of neighbouring families, mothers recalling rumours heard at market, brothers and sisters listening in silence as reputations were weighed like coin on a scale. To unite with a family of good standing was to secure stability, but to misstep was to risk the slow unravelling of respect that bound a household to its place in society. Honour was especially fragile for women. A daughter's virtue was seen as the reflection of her entire family. If she was thought to be less than modest, less than obedient, or less than proper, her family's honour could be stained, and her marriage prospects with it. Protecting this image was part of why parental control was so strict, for parents carried not only the responsibility of securing wealth, but of guarding reputation as if it were a flame easily extinguished by careless winds. And yet, honour was not only about fear of shame, it was also about pride. Families took joy in arranging matches that elevated their standing, weaving their names into more prominent lineages, or aligning themselves with households admired for their piety or their service to the crown. Such unions were celebrated not just as victories for individuals, but as triumphs for entire lineages. The Tudors themselves were deeply aware of this delicate balance. Henry VIII's marriages, though remembered today for their drama, were each bound up in questions of honour. Not only his personal honour as king, but the honour of England itself. To wed poorly was to weaken reputation at home and abroad. To wed wisely was to proclaim strength and dignity across Europe's courts. For the ordinary family, the stakes may have been smaller, but the sense of honour was no less intense. A blacksmith's daughter, marrying into a household known for kindness and hard work, could bring pride to her parents' name for years to come. A farmer's son, taking a wife from a family respected for their piety, could secure the quiet admiration of his neighbours. Reputation was not always written in chronicles of kings. It lived too in the gentle esteem of communities, in the way people spoke of a name when it was carried down the village road. Thus, in Tudor England, marriage was never only about the joining of two hearts, or even two households. It was about the invisible weight of family honour, the reputation that clung to names like a shadow, fragile yet enduring. To choose a spouse was to decide not only the future of one's own life, but the reflection cast upon all those bound by blood and name. In this way, marriage became both a duty and a mirror, showing society what a family valued, who they were, and how they wished to be remembered. If reputation was the invisible treasure of Tudor families, then dowry was the visible one, measured in coin, land, or goods, and carried into marriage as surely as a bride carried her veil. To speak of a match in Tudor England was to speak not only of names and alliances, but of what wealth would be exchanged. For a union without dowry was rarely considered complete. In many ways, dowry was not a gift at all, but a requirement, a cornerstone of the marriage contract that turned a union into a bond both legal and lasting. The idea was simple, though its effects reached far. A daughter, upon marrying, did not step into her new household empty-handed. She brought with her a portion of her family's wealth, carefully calculated and often painstakingly gathered over years. It might be a purse of silver, a piece of fertile land, livestock, or even valuable goods such as fine linens or jewellery. Whatever its form, it was the dowry that transformed her from daughter into wife, securing her place in her husband's household and protecting her, in theory, from being left without support. For noble families, the stakes were high. The size of a dowry could determine the quality of the match, opening doors to wealthier households or closing them just as swiftly. Fathers of daughters often felt the weight of this expectation heavily, for to fail to provide a sufficient dowry was to risk their child's future. Negotiations could stretch long into the night, letters passing between families with lists of what would be offered, what would be demanded, and what would be accepted as fair. Behind the polished courtesy of betrothal lay the steady hum of bargaining, as though marriage were both a sacred vow and a careful trade. Among the middle classes, dowries were no less significant, though humbler in form. A merchant's daughter might bring with her not vast lands but goods for trade, ensuring her husband could expand his business. A farmer's daughter might be given livestock or tools, providing her new household with the means to survive and thrive. In this way, dowry was both practical and symbolic, an acknowledgement that a woman carried not only her person into marriage, but a portion of her family's strength. Yet this requirement was not without hardship. Families with many daughters sometimes struggled under the burden, for each girl expected a dowry of her own. Younger daughters, in particular, might find their futures uncertain if family coffers ran dry. A poor dowry could mean a poorer match, and in a society where honour, reputation and survival were so deeply intertwined, the consequences of an insufficient dowry could last a lifetime. The system also reflected the limits placed upon women's independence. A dowry was not her possession to command, but a portion of her family's wealth, handed over to her husband upon marriage. In theory, it secured her protection. In practice, it often passed directly into the control of her new household. She became the vessel through which wealth was transferred, her role shaped less by her desires and more by the expectations of fathers and husbands. Still, within this framework there were glimmers of human resilience. Some families gave generous dowries not merely for advantage but out of affection, wanting to see their daughters well cared for. Some women took pride in the dowries they carried, knowing that the land or goods they brought would provide their children with stability. And in rare cases, when love did align with arrangement, dowry became less a burden and more a blessing, the practical foundation upon which companionship could quietly flourish. When a Tudor bride stepped across the threshold of her new household, she carried not only her presence, but the weight of her dowry. For her husband, this was more than a gesture. It was a promise of security, a safeguard against uncertainty, and a reinforcement of his standing within society. In a world where fortunes could shift with poor harvests, failed trade, or sudden illness, the dowry was a buffer, ensuring that the marriage began not with emptiness, but with tangible support. For men of noble rank, the financial security gained through marriage could be immense. Land was the true currency of the age, and to receive it through a wife's dowry was to expand his estate, his influence, and his legacy. A husband who married well might find himself with not only fertile fields, but with manors, rights, and rents, all of which secured his family's future for generations to come. In the corridors of power, such acquisitions mattered greatly, for wealth was the foundation upon which loyalty to the crown and presence at court were built. For merchants, tradesmen, and farmers, the meaning of security was more practical, though no less vital. A dowry might provide funds to purchase stock for a shop, tools for a craft, or animals for a farm. It might help pay off debts or stabilise a household after years of struggle. To marry a woman with even a modest dowry was to gain a cushion against the precariousness of daily life, a way of beginning the journey of family and home with some measure of confidence. In this sense, marriage functioned as an exchange not only of affection and alliance, but of stability. A husband did not marry in isolation. He married with the knowledge that his wife's dowry represented her family's trust in him, an investment placed in his hands. He was expected to use it wisely, to steward it with care, and to ensure that it contributed to the prosperity of the new household. Yet this arrangement, for all its practicality, also revealed the imbalance of power. The wealth a woman carried with her did not remain her own. Upon marriage, her dowry became her husband's to control. The financial security it provided was his, not hers, to manage. In theory, this meant protection, for if her husband prospered, so too would she. But in practice, it placed her entirely in his care, her family's gift becoming part of his domain. Still, within this pattern, there were stories of trust and tenderness. Some husbands valued their wives' contributions deeply, recognizing the sacrifice their families had made. A farmer might speak with gratitude of the cows his wife brought as dowry, which fed his children through lean winters. A merchant might quietly thank his wife for the coin that allowed his business to grow, giving both of them a more comfortable life. In such cases, the financial security provided by dowry was not only practical, but also a shared foundation, a silent partner in their life together. But there were also stories of misuse. A careless husband could squander his wife's dowry, spending it on reckless ventures or lavish displays. For the wife, there was little recourse. What had once been her family's gift was now absorbed into her husband's authority. This vulnerability underscored the fragility of her position, reminding us how deeply women's lives were tied to the stewardship of the men they married. And so, the dowry became a symbol of dual meaning. For the husband, it offered security, a safeguard against hardship, a resource to build upon. For the wife, it was both protection and loss, a sacrifice made in the hope that it would ensure her care and her children's future. In every quiet chapel where vows were spoken, in every hall where families gathered to celebrate, there was this silent understanding that marriage was not only about hearts and names, but about the wealth that made a household strong. Though marriage in Tudor England was meant to bind families together in peace and stability, money often carried shadows with it. Wealth could strengthen a household, but it could just as easily become a source of discord. Behind closed doors, away from the ceremonies and feasts, disputes over coin, land and property stirred tension, sometimes quietly, sometimes with voices raised above the crackle of the hearth fire. It began, often, with expectations unmet. A family might promise a dowry larger than what they could truly provide, hoping to secure a better match for their daughter. When the truth was revealed, disappointment and resentment could take root. Husbands felt deceived, wives felt ashamed, and in the silence between them, love, if there was any, grew strained. A marriage that had seemed secure could stumble on the uneven stones of broken promises. Even when dowries were fully honoured, questions remained over how that wealth was used. A thrifty husband might guard his wife's portion so closely that she never saw its benefit, while a reckless one might spend it quickly on ventures that failed. For women, there was little power to challenge such choices, yet frustration lingered. The very gift meant to ensure their safety sometimes became the cause of their unease, as they watched resources slip away into waste. Property, too, was a common spark for quarrels. Land given, as dowry was expected to merge into the husband's estate, but boundaries were not always clear. A meadow claimed by one family might be contested by the other, neighbours drawn into disputes that outlived the original agreement. In villages, where fields stretched side by side, such arguments could sour relations between households for years, each side clinging fiercely to its sense of right. Money also revealed the delicate balance between duty and desire. Some husbands, facing debts or hardships, turned back to their wives' families for help. To ask was humbling, to refuse was insulting. Parents, already burdened by the expense of dowries for several daughters, might resist, straining the fragile ties between in-laws. What was meant to be a union of harmony sometimes hardened into a contest of obligation, each family guarding its resources, each unwilling to give more than it had promised. And yet, these conflicts were not limited to the wealthy. Even among ordinary folk, a handful of coins could hold the weight of survival. A farmer struggling with poor harvests might quarrel with his wife over how best to use the few pennies she had brought as dowry. A merchant might resent the pressure to expand his trade with funds that were never quite enough. In such homes, arguments over money were not grand disputes over estates, but quiet struggles over bread, seed, and the future of children. The church preached patience and unity, urging couples to endure one another's faults, but sermons could not soften the sting of hunger or debt. Families turned to local courts when quarrels grew too sharp, seeking justice in disputes over land, promises, or payments. These legal battles, though slow and costly, show us how common money conflicts were, even in an age where marriage was wrapped in ritual and reverence. Still, amidst these struggles, not every household fell into ruin. Some couples learned to weather their disagreements, finding compromise in shared effort. A husband might come to value his wife's counsel in managing their small estate. A wife might take quiet pride in helping stretch their limited means. Though money could divide, it could also, in the hands of those who work together, become a lesson in endurance and partnership. In the end, the conflicts over money remind us that Tudor marriages were not only shaped by ceremony and law, but by the daily rhythms of life, by fields planted and harvests gathered, by debts counted and coins exchanged. Beneath the grand alliances of kings and nobles, beneath the solemn vows spoken in stone churches, there were always these human struggles, where love and loyalty were tested not by words, but by the weight of silver and the needs of survival. In Tudor England, love was a dream that often stood in the shadows, quietly present but seldom given the place of honour. Marriages were contracts, woven from threads of duty, wealth, and family obligation. And yet, though rare, there were times when affection found its way into these arrangements. Moments when two people discovered in each other more than a name, more than a fortune, more than the weight of expectation. These rare love matches shimmered like candlelight in the dark, fragile but unforgettable. For most men and women, choice in marriage was limited, bound by the wishes of parents or the demands of alliances. Yet stories have survived of couples who grew to cherish one another, even if love was not the starting point. A bride, timid on her wedding day, might slowly find kindness in her husband's words, discovering a tenderness that turned duty into something warmer. A groom, weary of negotiations, might learn to admire his wife's quiet strength, her laughter brightening the halls of his home. In such households, affection blossomed slowly, like ivy climbing old stone, unexpected yet enduring. Among the nobility, love matches were especially scarce, for politics left little room for sentiment. Kings and queens were bound by treaties, their marriages designed to secure thrones rather than hearts. Yet even here, whispers of true affection emerge. Henry VIII, before ambition and obsession darkened his path, seemed genuinely charmed by Anne Boleyn, pursuing her not merely for alliance but with passion. Their story ended in tragedy, yet it reminds us that even within the strictest cages of duty, the human heart sometimes stirred restlessly, demanding its place. For those of humbler means, the possibility of marrying for love was slightly greater, though still shaped by survival. A farmer's son and daughter, neighbours since childhood, might persuade their families to bless a union that had grown from years of shared fields and familiar laughter. A craftsman, earning enough to stand on his own, might choose a wife for her companionship rather than her dowry. These matches were not common, but they did exist, woven quietly into the fabric of village life. The beauty of these rare unions lay in their ordinary intimacy. While grand families measured honour and estate, love matches were built on simple gestures. A shared glance at market, a comforting word after a long day's work, a song sung together at a winter's hearth. In such marriages, wealth might be scarce, but joy was not entirely absent. The bonds they forged were fragile in a society that valued duty above desire, yet they offered a glimpse of something freer, something that belongs not to law or custom, but to the heart itself. Still, to marry for love alone was often seen as reckless. Families worried that affection would fade while debts remained. Parents feared that young people, blinded by passion, might make choices that dishonoured their name or weakened their standing. And so, even when love was present, it was often hidden beneath the formal language of duty, acknowledged only in the quiet spaces between husband and wife. But when it was real, when love truly guided a match, it had the power to soften the harshness of the age. A poor harvest was easier to bear when burdens were shared with someone cherished. The loss of a child, a grief all too common, became less unbearable when sorrow was met with shared arms. These rare matches did not erase the struggles of Tudor life, but they offered warmth within them, a private sanctuary of tenderness in a world that demanded so much. In Tudor England, marriage was never only a private vow whispered between two souls. It was a thread in a much larger fabric, woven with the colours of family ambition, social expectation, and even the fate of kingdoms. Every match, from the humblest village union to the grandest royal wedding, carried with it a sense of responsibility that stretched beyond the couple themselves. To marry was to serve one's household, to serve one's lineage, and in some cases to serve the crown. For families of noble rank, duty was clear and heavy. A son or daughter was not free to choose as the heart wished, for their marriages were instruments of strategy. Through carefully arranged unions, families extended their lands, secured political allies, and protected their honour. A daughter's hand could bring a family closer to the court, while a son's marriage could cement ties with powerful neighbours. Love, if it appeared, was only a gentle shadow. The true light was duty, shining with the weight of expectation. For royalty, the stakes rose even higher. The marriages of kings and queens were not merely family matters, but national ones. When Henry VIII sought to marry Catherine of Aragon, it was not only a union of two people, but a bond between England and Spain, a partnership meant to steady crowns and armies. Later, when his marriages multiplied, they sent ripples across Europe, each new queen signalling either alliance or fracture. The king's private life was never truly his own. It was the kingdom's, bound to diplomacy and the shifting tides of power. Yet even outside noble circles, the sense of duty to family was no less pressing. In towns and villages, marriages were arranged with the hope of survival, prosperity and stability. A farmer's son might marry into a household with good fields. A craftsman might seek a bride whose dowry brought tools or coin. These choices, guided by parents and elders, were not only about two lives joined, but about the well-being of everyone tied to them. To wed poorly was to risk not only personal hardship, but the hardship of kin who depended upon the strength of the household. The duty carried by women was especially profound. A daughter was expected to bring honour to her family, to marry wisely, and to uphold the reputation of her name. When she entered her husband's household, she bore the responsibility of ensuring harmony between the two families. Her behaviour, her faithfulness, even her ability to bear children were viewed not as private matters, but as reflections of her family's success in fulfilling their duty to society. For men, duty meant stewardship. A husband was expected to guard his wife, to manage her dowry well, and to raise children who would carry the family name forward. In him lay the task of ensuring the household thrived, not only for his own sake, but for the generations that would come after. And so, in every Tudor marriage, beneath the vows and celebrations, there lingered this steady truth, that one's life was not entirely one's own. To marry was to take on the hopes and burdens of those who stood behind you, your parents, your kin, your community, and sometimes your country. It was a duty that could inspire pride, binding families into networks of strength, but it could also weigh heavily, pressing down upon those who longed for choice and freedom. Marriage in Tudor England was not only a matter of wealth, dowries and duty. It was also a story of quiet sacrifices, often unseen beyond the walls of the home. Couples, bound by expectations greater than themselves, learned to set aside desires, affections, and sometimes even their true selves in order to carry the burdens that society and family placed upon their shoulders. These emotional sacrifices, though seldom spoken of in chronicles, formed the tender and sometimes sorrowful undercurrent of married life. For many women, sacrifice began on the day of marriage itself. A daughter, often scarcely more than a girl, left the familiarity of her parents' house to live under the roof of a man she might not know well. She surrendered her childhood and her independence in one sweeping moment, stepping into a role chosen for her by others. Even if affection later grew, the initial sacrifice was real. The leaving behind of all that was known, all that was safe, in exchange for duty to a new household. Men too bore sacrifices of a different kind. A young husband might feel the weight of expectation pressing down before he had even found his footing in the world. He was suddenly responsible not only for his wife, but for the prosperity of an entire household. His own dreams, of study, of travel, of choosing a partner freely, often had to be set aside. Instead, he bent himself to the work of fulfilling his family's hopes, his desires tucked quietly into the background. There was also the sacrifice of love itself. In an age when rare love matches were spoken of like legends, many couples accepted that affection would not guide their lives. They sacrificed the dream of marrying for passion or companionship, choosing instead to build their lives upon necessity. Some learned with patience to grow fond of each other over the years. Others endured marriages that remained distant, a duty shared but never warmed by affection. In both cases, the sacrifice was heavy, a surrender of the heart to the will of society. Children, too, brought their own form of emotional sacrifice. A wife was expected to bear many, though childbirth was dangerous and loss was common. Mothers who mourned infants or young children often had little time to grieve, for they were soon called upon to continue the cycle again. Fathers, though less openly expressive, carried their grief quietly as well, watching futures slip away in the fragility of young lives. The sacrifice here was not only physical but deeply emotional, the endurance of sorrow while maintaining strength for the family that remained. Couples also sacrificed privacy. In Tudor villages and towns, households were rarely large, and lives unfolded under the watchful eyes of kin and neighbours. Marital disagreements, struggles with money, even whispers of affection or scandal were rarely hidden. A husband and wife might long for a life of their own making, but they were instead bound to the opinions and judgments of the wider world. The sacrifice of individuality, of being known simply as themselves, was part of married existence. And yet, these sacrifices were not always bleak. Many couples accepted them as the cost of survival, finding comfort in shared endurance. There was a quiet dignity in bearing hardship together, in knowing that their sacrifices kept not only themselves but their families and communities secure. For some, sacrifice even deepened companionship. A husband and wife, working side by side in the fields or at the hearth, might look upon each other with a bond born not of romance but of shared struggle, a tenderness forged in the fires of endurance. In this way, the emotional sacrifices of Tudor couples remind us of the human heart's resilience. Though dreams were set aside, though desires were often silenced, life carried on with a kind of steady courage. Beneath the weight of duty and the strictness of society, there lived quiet acts of endurance, unseen but powerful. These were the sacrifices that shaped marriages not as tales of passion but as stories of survival, perseverance, and a strength that was both ordinary and extraordinary. To understand marriage in Tudor England, one must look not only at love, duty and sacrifice, but also at the law, for it was the law that quietly governed the lives of wives. Beneath the surface of everyday life, there was an invisible framework, a set of rules that defined what a woman was allowed to hold, what she was expected to surrender, and how much of herself she was permitted to keep once vows were spoken. The legal status of wives was a world of limits and dependence, shaping marriage into something far more binding than affection alone. At the heart of it lay a principle known as coverture. Under this idea, once a woman married, her legal identity was said to be covered by that of her husband. She could not own property in her own right. She could not sign contracts. She could not bring a case to court without his name standing before hers. In the eyes of the law, a wife was not truly separate. She became, in essence, part of her husband. Her rights folded into his, as the smaller flame is absorbed by the larger. This meant that the dowry she carried into marriage, though given to protect her, usually passed directly under her husband's control. Land, livestock, or coin that had once been her family's was no longer hers to command. If her husband was wise, it was used to build a secure life. If he was careless, it could be lost with little recourse for her. The very gift meant to safeguard her future was swallowed up by the structure of law that placed husbands as masters of the household. There were, however, small protections. Some families, especially among the wealthy, drew up marriage contracts to set aside certain rights for the wife. A jointure, for example, might guarantee her income if she was widowed, ensuring she would not be left destitute. But these protections were the exception rather than the rule, and they depended entirely upon the foresight of her family and the goodwill of her husband's kin. For women of humbler status, the law's limitations were often felt in daily, practical ways. A wife who helped her husband in the fields, or who sold goods at the market, did so not as an independent worker but under his legal shadow. Her labour was vital, her contribution undeniable, yet her name rarely appeared in records or agreements. It was as though her efforts were invisible to the law, absorbed into her husband's standing as surely as her identity was under coverture. This dependence could weigh heavily when marriages faltered. A wife mistreated by her husband had little recourse, for divorce was nearly impossible under church law, and separation left her vulnerable without property or support. Some turned to their families for shelter, others endured in silence, their legal invisibility binding them to lives of hardship. And yet, within this structure, women found quiet ways to exert influence. A wife might guide her husband's decisions with gentle counsel, her words shaping choices though her name never appeared on the deeds. She might manage the household accounts, stretching every coin, ensuring survival where the law saw only her husband's authority. Power, though unseen in law, could still be felt in the rhythms of daily life. Still, the reality remained. In Tudor England, a wife was not her own. She was bound legally, socially, and economically to her husband, her identity tied to his in every formal sense. The law, like the church, saw marriage as emerging, but it was emerging unequal in weight. The husband stood as the figure of authority, the wife as the figure of dependence. In Tudor England, property was power. To hold land or wealth was to hold independence, to command respect, and to secure the future of one's children. Yet for women, especially wives, this power was rarely within reach. The laws and customs of the age wove property tightly into the hands of men, leaving wives dependent upon their husbands and families, their lives shaped by rights they could not claim as their own. The principle of coverture, which absorbed a wife's legal identity into her husband's, meant that any property she might have brought into marriage no longer remained hers. Land, goods, or coin became part of her husband's estate, under his name and his authority. A woman who once carried her dowry proudly as her portion of family wealth saw it vanish into the larger body of her husband's holdings, as though she herself had disappeared into his shadow. For noble families, this loss was sometimes softened by contracts. Parents, wary of entrusting their daughters to uncertain futures, might arrange jointures, agreements that guaranteed a widow some share of land or income if her husband died. These contracts, carefully drawn and sealed, were a way of protecting daughters against the harshness of law. Yet such measures were limited to those who had the resources and foresight to secure them. For many women, especially those of modest means, no such safeguards existed. Among ordinary folk, property rights were even more distant. A farmer's wife who worked the fields alongside her husband could not lay claim to the land she toiled upon. A merchant's wife who kept accounts or tended shop could not hold the business in her own name. Her labour was essential, her presence visible, yet the ownership of everything she touched remained firmly in the hands of her husband. It was a quiet erasure, not of her work, but of her recognition. This absence of property rights shaped women's lives most painfully in times of loss. When a husband died, his land and goods usually passed to sons or male relatives, leaving the widow dependent upon their kindness. If she was granted a dower, a customary share of her late husband's estate, it was often only enough to keep her modestly, never to give her real authority. Widows who lacked sons or supportive kin were especially vulnerable, living on the edge of poverty despite years of shared labour. The church and the courts upheld these rules, seeing them as part of the natural order. A household was imagined as a single body, with the husband as its head. Property belonged to him because authority belonged to him, and the wife's role was to serve within that structure. It was thought that by denying women property rights, harmony was maintained, though in truth it often left wives without security, their futures dependent on the choices of men. Yet, as with all strict systems, there were small cracks where women found ways to assert themselves. Some widows, left without sons, managed estates on behalf of their families, proving capable stewards even within the limits of the law. Others shaped inheritance through persuasion, urging husbands or kin to favour children, daughters, or trusted relatives. Their influence was often invisible in records, but it was real in the decisions quietly made around hearths and in chambers. Still, the wider truth remains. In Tudor England, property belonged to men, and women's place within that system was one of dependence. The lack of property rights did not only affect wealth, it touched upon identity, dignity, and power. To live without ownership was to live without the freedom to choose, to plan, to secure one's own destiny. And so, as vows were spoken in candlelit churches, as couples began their lives together under the gaze of family and community, every Tudor bride carried with her this silent understanding that whatever wealth she brought, whatever labour she gave, it would not belong to her. It would be absorbed into her husband's name as surely as her own rights were. In this way, the lack of property rights shaped not only households, but the very fabric of women's lives, binding them to dependence even as they sustained the world around them. If the law defined what women could or could not do in Tudor England, society shaped how they were expected to live, weaving invisible threads of duty and behaviour around their daily existence. A wife's world was not only measured by contracts, inheritances, and property, but also by the softer, unwritten rules of conduct. Rules that carried no parchment seal yet bound her every bit as firmly. These expectations hovered in the air of every hall, cottage, and marketplace, forming a quiet script that women were taught from childhood to follow. At the heart of these expectations was obedience. A wife was to honour her husband not only through her actions, but through her demeanour, soft-spoken, patient, and yielding. The church taught that man was the head of the household and woman its heart, and thus her role was to support rather than to command. A woman who was too outspoken, too bold, or too independent could find herself whispered about by neighbours, marked as unruly or improper. Reputation was fragile, and once cracked, it could never fully be repaired. Chastity and modesty were equally prized. Before marriage, a woman was expected to remain pure, her virtue guarded as a treasure not only for herself but for her entire family's honour. After marriage, fidelity was demanded without question, for an unfaithful wife brought shame upon her husband's name and cast doubt upon the inheritance of children. The burden of purity rested almost entirely upon women, shaping the way they dressed, spoke, and moved through the world. A wife was also expected to embody industriousness. In noble households, this meant managing servants, ensuring the running of estates, and overseeing the smooth rhythm of meals, accounts, and guests. In humbler cottages, it meant grinding grain, weaving cloth, tending gardens, and caring for children. Idleness in a woman was frowned upon, seen as both moral weakness and social failing. Her work, though rarely recorded in ledgers, was the backbone of family life, and diligence was regarded as a measure of her worth. Beyond the walls of home, women were expected to display humility in public spaces. Markets and festivals gave them room to participate in the life of the community, yet they were encouraged to remain modest in their manner, careful not to draw undue attention. The ideal Tudor woman was present but not loud, capable but not commanding, visible yet never dominant. This balance was delicate, requiring constant vigilance, for a woman who misstepped could earn gossip that clung like shadow. Mothers carried further expectations still. They were to raise children not only in health and skill, but also in piety and obedience. Sons were to be prepared for their roles in work or inheritance, and daughters were to be shaped into future wives who would themselves carry the same burdens of modesty, chastity, and diligence. In this way, each woman became both a keeper of tradition and a teacher of the next generation, ensuring that the expectations placed upon her would live on in her children. And yet, within these narrow frames, women carved out quiet spaces of identity. Some found joy in the running of a busy household, seeing in their work a reflection of skill and intelligence. Others took pride in the harmony of family life, in guiding their children, or in weaving moments of warmth into the fabric of duty. Though society's script was rigid, individual women found ways to soften its edges, shaping lives that carried both conformity and quiet resistance. To live as a Tudor wife was to walk a careful line, balancing duty, modesty, and diligence under the watchful gaze of family, neighbours, and church. Every gesture, every word, and every choice was measured against expectation. And though these expectations often limited freedom, they also gave women a framework within which they learned to create meaning, strength, and even a kind of subtle authority. In Tudor England, the question of when a boy or girl was old enough to marry was not answered in the way we might think today. Childhood was brief, and adulthood came quickly, shaped not only by the turning of years, but by the needs of families, the rhythms of work, and the watchful presence of the church. The minimum age for marriage was surprisingly young, yet the practice itself was more complex, softened by custom, circumstance, and expectation. According to church law, the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. At these ages, a marriage could be considered valid if consent was given. This law came from older traditions, inherited from medieval canon law, and it reflected a world in which life was often short and families hurried to secure alliances and property before uncertainty could sweep them away. To modern ears, these numbers sound startlingly low, but in the Tudor imagination, they represented readiness in body and spirit, at least in theory. Yet it is important to understand that while the law allowed such early unions, the reality was often different. Most marriages, especially among ordinary people, took place later when young men and women were old enough to contribute to the household. A farmer's son needed the strength of adulthood to plough, sow, and reap. A daughter needed the skill of managing bread, cloth, and children before taking her own household. As a result, marriages commonly took place in the late teens or early 20s, when both partners could sustain the work of family life. For the nobility, however, the picture could be more complicated. Daughters of great houses might be betrothed in childhood, their futures sealed by agreement long before they understood what marriage meant. At 12 or 13, a girl could be formally wed, though often the union was not consummated until she was older. Such matches were tools of diplomacy, ways of binding two families, two estates, or even two kingdoms together. In these cases, marriage was less about readiness and more about strategy, with youth itself used as a bargaining chip. Boys, though permitted to marry at 14, often wed somewhat later. A young man needed to inherit land or establish a trade before he could realistically provide for a wife. Among peasants and townsfolk, this meant that many waited until their early 20s, when work and wages allowed them to build a stable household. For sons of noble families, inheritance dictated timing. A boy might be married young if his father needed an alliance, or he might wait if estates and titles were not yet secure. The difference in ages between bride and groom was often striking. It was not uncommon for girls to marry older men, sometimes a decade or more their senior, especially if wealth, property, or power was involved. For a young woman, this meant stepping into marriage not as an equal partner in years, but as a companion to someone already seasoned by experience. Her youth, in such cases, symbolized fertility and the promise of heirs, while his maturity represented stability and control. Behind these customs lay a deep sense of urgency. Life in Tudor England was uncertain, marked by illness, war, and the constant shadow of mortality. To marry young was to ensure children could be born quickly, inheritances secured swiftly, and alliances strengthened without delay. The brevity of life demanded haste, even in matters as solemn as marriage, and yet, despite the laws and customs, there was a humanity that often tempered them. Parents considered not only age but readiness, weighing whether a daughter could manage a household or a son could carry a farm upon his shoulders. The church, though permitting early marriage, often encouraged delay until maturity made the union more stable. In this way, the rigid minimum ages gave way to a softer, more practical rhythm, guided by the realities of daily life. Thus, the story of marriageable age in Tudor England is not one of numbers alone, but of balance, between law and custom, between haste and prudence, between the fragile urgency of life and the steady hope of family. Girls at 12 and boys at 14 might have stood at the doorway of marriage in theory, but in practice most waited until strength, skill, and circumstance allowed them to step through together into the life that awaited. In the Tudor world, marriage was not always a private bond between two people, nor even a matter of family survival alone. For the noble and royal houses of England, It was a thread woven into the grander tapestry of politics, diplomacy, and ambition. Early marriages, especially for daughters, were often arranged not because love or even readiness was present, but because an alliance was needed and time could not be wasted. These unions were less about companionship and more about the joining of names, lands, and loyalties. Among the nobility, a daughter's hand was a gift her family could use to secure its place in a shifting world. Families sought to link themselves to greater houses, to bind rivals into friendship, or to place their bloodline closer to the crown. A girl of 12 or 13 might be promised in marriage to a man twice her age, not because she was thought ready to manage a household, but because the bond her presence created was worth more than her inexperience. The wedding in such cases was not the beginning of a personal story, but a chapter in a political one. Royal marriages made this practice even more visible. Kings and queens looked far beyond England's borders for suitable partners, seeing in marriage a way to cement treaties or ease tensions. A princess could be betrothed while still a child, her name carried across seas in the form of contracts and promises. Sometimes she would be sent abroad at a tender age, raised in a foreign court until she was old enough for her marriage to be fulfilled. Her youth mattered less than the hope her presence carried, the hope of peace, prosperity, or strengthened alliances between nations. For noble sons, too, early marriages could serve as tools of alliance. A boy of 14, still closer to childhood than manhood, might be joined to a bride chosen to expand his family's estates or reinforce its standing. His own desires were of little weight compared to the advantages gained. In such unions, both bride and groom were instruments in the hands of their elders, their futures shaped long before they understood what it meant to share a life. Yet even within these arrangements, caution was often exercised. Though marriages could be formalised when boys and girls were young, consummation was sometimes delayed until they were older, allowing them time to grow into their roles. Still, the vows, once spoken, bound them. The alliance was sealed, and its benefits already claimed, long before the couple could truly live as a husband and wife. For the families involved, these early marriages brought both security and risk. To bind oneself to another house was to share fortunes as well as failures. If a son-in-law fell from favour at court, or if a new monarch shifted the balance of power, an alliance once thought secure could become a burden. This uncertainty was the price of ambition, and daughters and sons bore it in the form of lives promised for purposes larger than themselves. Among ordinary people, such early alliances were far less common. Peasants and townsfolk rarely had reason to marry children for strategy. Survival was their concern, and marriages were delayed until work and wages made them possible. But the shadow of noble alliances still touched their lives, for the fates of kingdoms and estates shaped the world in which they lived. And so, early marriages for alliances reveal a truth about Tudor England, that marriage was both personal and political, intimate and strategic. For those born into power, it was not merely a union of two individuals, but a tool that could secure peace, extend influence, or even decide the destiny of nations. Behind every youthful bride in silks and jewels, behind every solemn boy-groom in velvet doublet, there lay a story far greater than themselves. A story of families seeking strength, of kingdoms reaching for stability, and of children who became, before their time, the keepers of their elders' ambitions. Though the laws of Tudor England allowed marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, the reality of such unions carried with it deep risks, both for the individuals and for the families who arranged them. Child marriage may have served the purposes of alliance or inheritance, but beneath the surface of strategy and ceremony lay a more fragile truth: that the bodies and minds of children were not always ready for the burdens thrust upon them. The most immediate risk was physical. A girl of 12 or 13, still in the early stages of her growth, might not have been prepared for the demands of childbirth. To carry and deliver children at so young an age could be dangerous, sometimes fatal, for both mother and infant. Tudor medicine, with its limited knowledge and fragile remedies, could do little to ease such dangers. The church might bless these unions and families might celebrate them with feasts, but behind closed doors many young brides faced the silent shadow of mortality when they entered the childbed. Beyond the body, there was also the weight placed upon the mind. A child bride or groom, scarcely more than a child in thought, was suddenly expected to manage a household, to carry the responsibilities of obedience, authority, and provision. Imagine the bewilderment of a girl asked to oversee servants or to raise infants when she herself had only just left her own childhood. Or a boy, hardly strong enough to command labour or estates, pressed into the role of husband before he had learned the rhythm of manhood. These roles could overwhelm, leaving them vulnerable to failure, resentment, or despair. Socially, too, child marriage carried its risks. An alliance built upon the shoulders of children could prove unstable, for neither partner had the maturity to maintain harmony or balance. Conflict could arise, not only between husband and wife, but between their families, as youthful mistakes strained ties that were meant to secure peace. A careless word, an unwise choice, or even the simple inexperience of youth could unravel the careful planning of elders. There was also the risk of unconsummated marriages lingering in uncertainty. Though vows could be spoken at 12 or 14, the union might not be physically fulfilled for years. During this time, disputes could arise. Families might fall from favour, fortunes might shift, or political tides might change. What was once a promising alliance could become a liability, leaving young brides and grooms caught in contracts they could not undo, their lives suspended between hope and obligation. Emotionally, the risks were profound. Children promised in marriage were denied the chance to grow naturally into adulthood. Their choices, small as they might have been, were stripped away before they could be exercised. Affection, love, even simple friendship were often absent at the start, replaced by duty imposed from above. Some grew into companionship, learning to love with time, but others lived in quiet sorrow, their lives shaped by bonds they had not freely chosen. For girls especially, the risks carried an added weight. Youthful wives were expected to bear heirs quickly, to prove their worth through fertility, and to do so while still navigating the transition from child to woman. Failure to produce children could bring shame or rejection, while success often came at the cost of health. It was a double-edged demand, and one many struggled to meet. And yet, despite these dangers, child marriages continued, upheld by custom, law, and necessity. Families saw in them opportunity, security, and ambition, rarely acknowledging the toll on those whose lives were most affected. The risks were known, but they were often accepted as the price of survival, in a world where property, lineage, and alliance mattered more than individual readiness. In the Tudor age, few marriages carried as much weight as those made within the royal family. For kings and queens, a wedding was never simply a bond between two hearts, nor even the uniting of two households. It was an act of strategy, a gesture that could reshape kingdoms, bind allies, or ignite rivalries. Every royal match was a thread woven into the vast tapestry of power, and its consequences reached far beyond the couple themselves. For Tudor monarchs, the choice of spouse was both deeply personal and entirely political. The king or queen might carry their own desires, their own hopes for companionship or affection, but these were often set aside in the face of duty. A partner was chosen not for charm or beauty alone, but for the lands they brought, the allies they secured, and the enemies they might pacify. In this way, a royal marriage was less a union of individuals, and more a treaty written in flesh and blood. Consider Henry VII, the first Tudor king, whose marriage to Elizabeth of York in 1486 helped to end the Wars of the Roses. Their union symbolised the healing of a kingdom torn by decades of conflict, joining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. In this marriage, the very survival of a dynasty was secured, and the foundation of Tudor power was laid. The wedding was not merely a celebration of two young people, but a moment of reconciliation for an entire realm. Later monarchs continued this tradition. Foreign brides and grooms were sought to strengthen England's ties across Europe. A princess might be promised to the heir of Spain, a prince to the daughter of France, each match designed to create bonds that words alone could not guarantee. To stand at the altar in such unions was to stand at the very centre of diplomacy, one's vows carrying the weight of nations. Yet these marriages, though crowned with splendour, were not without risk. To ally with one kingdom was often to offend another. When Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, was married to the ageing King Louis XII of France, the match was meant to seal peace between the two kingdoms. Yet it also stirred tensions elsewhere, reminding rival powers of England's shifting loyalties. Similarly, Mary I's union with Philip of Spain decades later brought deep unease within her own country, where many feared England might be swallowed by the might of the Spanish crown. For the royals themselves, the burden of such marriages was immense. A queen sent abroad as a bride often left behind her homeland forever, carrying with her not only her dowry but also the expectations of her people. She was a stranger in a foreign court, bound to serve as both wife and diplomat, her every word and gesture reflecting upon the kingdom she had left behind. Kings too bore the weight of judgment, for the choice of consort could elevate their reputation or cast suspicion upon their rule. Love, in these arrangements, was often a quiet hope rather than an expectation. Some couples grew into companionship, finding warmth within the cold frame of politics. Others remained distant, their union a duty endured rather than a partnership cherished. Yet whether joy or sorrow, every royal marriage was recorded in chronicles, remembered not for its intimacy, but for its impact upon history. While royal unions were forged for power, and noble marriages often tied to land and alliance, the marriages of the growing Tudor middle class carried a different purpose: stability. For merchants, tradesmen, lawyers and clerks, marriage was a way of securing the future of both household and livelihood. It was not only about companionship, though affection sometimes found its place, but about building a partnership strong enough to endure the shifting fortunes of town and trade. The middle class of Tudor England was a world in motion, resting between the grandeur of the nobility and the toil of the peasantry. These families owned shops, kept accounts, managed workshops, or worked in the growing machinery of law and administration. Their lives required careful balance. One eye on profit, one on reputation, and both fixed firmly upon respectability. Marriage, in this setting, was less dramatic than in royal courts, but no less vital, for it offered a foundation upon which both business and family could rest. For a merchant, a wife was often a partner in trade. She might keep the accounts, tend to customers, oversee apprentices, or manage the household while her husband travelled to market towns or distant ports. Though the law placed her under his authority, in practice her role was indispensable, and many marriages flourished as cooperative ventures. Together, husband and wife built stability not only for themselves but for their children, ensuring the family's place within the community. Dowries still played their part, though on a smaller scale than among nobles. A modest dowry of money, cloth or household goods could provide the couple with a start, helping them secure a home or expand a shop. For middle-class families, the dowry was less a matter of prestige than of practicality, a way of ensuring that the new household began on firm ground. Parents on both sides often weighed a match carefully, asking whether the union would bring steadiness to their children's lives, whether through resources, connections, or character. Respectability was the true coin of the middle class. A well-matched marriage was one that preserved reputation, for gossip could harm business as surely as poor trade. A wife who was modest, industrious, and skilled in household management was considered a treasure, not simply for her character, but for the way she upheld the family's good name. In turn, a husband was expected to provide faithfully, avoiding recklessness or scandal that could bring ruin upon both home and shop. Unlike the nobility, where children could be married in early alliances, the middle class often delayed unions until both bride and groom were ready to contribute. Men waited until their apprenticeships were complete, or until they had saved enough to keep a household. Women too often married in their later teens or early 20s, once they had gathered the skills of household management or learned the trade of their family. The result was that many middle-class marriages began on firmer ground, with partners better prepared for the responsibilities that awaited them. Though arranged to some degree, these marriages left more room for mutual choice than those of higher ranks. Parents guided their children, but affection was not dismissed if it aligned with prudence. A young man and woman might meet through family connections, church gatherings, or trade circles, and if respect and attraction grew between them, it was often welcomed, so long as it did not endanger stability. In the end, the story of middle-class marriage in Tudor England is one of balance, balancing affection with duty, ambition with prudence, and household work with trade. These unions may not have altered the fate of kingdoms, but they sustained the quiet strength of towns and communities, where shops bustled, workshops rang with craft, and households kept their steady rhythm. For in the Tudor middle class, marriage was not about grandeur or glory, but about steadiness. It was about two people standing together, supporting one another, and weaving a life that would carry them safely through the uncertainties of the age. Stability, more than power or ambition, was the treasure they sought, and in many homes it was the treasure they found. In Tudor England, life for peasants was hard and unrelenting. Their days were filled with labour, their nights with weariness, and their futures bound tightly to the soil they worked. For them, marriage was not a stage for political ambitions, nor a calculated move for reputation and trade, but a fragile hope of survival. To marry was to gain a partner in toil, someone who could help shoulder the endless tasks of daily life, from tending the fields to raising children, from keeping a fire alive in winter to finding enough food to last until the next harvest. In a world where poverty pressed constantly at the door, survival often required two pairs of hands. A man alone might work the land, but without a wife to keep house, prepare food, and manage the family's small resources, his household could falter. A woman alone faced an even harsher path, for opportunities to earn her bread were few, and the dangers of vulnerability were many. In this way, marriage offered protection, shared labour, and the possibility, however slim, of a steadier life. Unlike the carefully planned unions of nobles or the cautiously arranged matches of the middle class, peasant marriages were often simple and local. A young man might marry the girl from the next cottage. A woman might join with a farm labourer from a neighbouring village. Choice was shaped less by wealth or alliance, and more by immediate need and familiarity. Families had little to offer in dowries beyond a few animals, a chest of linens, or perhaps some tools for the new household. What truly mattered was whether the couple could work side by side to keep hunger at bay. The home they built together was modest, a timbered cottage with a thatched roof, perhaps just 1 or 2 rooms. Within, possessions were few: a rough bed of straw, a wooden table, some clay pots, a fire for cooking and warmth. Yet even such simplicity was hard-won, for rents were owed to landlords and harvests were uncertain. A poor yield could bring hunger, a harsh winter could bring sickness, and in such times the strength of a marriage was tested by hardship. Children too were part of this struggle. In noble houses, heirs were symbols of dynasty, but in peasant families they were extra hands for labour. Sons and daughters helped in the fields, fetched water, gathered firewood, and tended animals. Yet each child also meant another mouth to feed, and in times of scarcity the burden grew heavier. Still, many peasants saw children as a blessing, for they brought hope of survival into the uncertain years ahead. Peasant marriages, though forged in necessity, were not entirely without tenderness. Affection sometimes blossomed between couples who had grown up side by side, sharing the same earth, the same hardships, the same hopes. Yet even love was tested by the demands of survival, as labour and worry often left little room for leisure or ease. A smile exchanged at the end of a long day, a hand reaching across a table, the quiet comfort of shared burdens. These were the small intimacies that sustained them. Religion also shaped their unions. Marriage in the eyes of the church gave legitimacy to children, and it bound couples under vows that promised endurance through both hardship and scarcity. Weddings were modest affairs, often held in the local parish, with simple feasting afterwards if food could be spared. Still, for that brief moment, even peasants shared in the joy of union, their hearts lifted by ritual and the sense that together they might face what lay ahead. In Tudor England, marriage was not only a private arrangement between two families, it was a sacred act, bound tightly to the authority of the church. Without the church's blessing, a union was seen as incomplete, even illegitimate. The vows spoken beneath a priest's guidance were not merely words. They were believed to carry divine weight, linking husband and wife not only to each other, but also to God. And so, whether one was a nobleman seeking alliance, a merchant seeking stability, or a peasant seeking survival, the church stood as the final gatekeeper of matrimony. The church's influence stretched into every corner of the process. Bans of marriage. Public announcements read aloud in the parish for 3 successive Sundays ensured that no union could slip quietly into place. This ritual gave the community a chance to raise objections, whether due to kinship too close, a promise already made to another, or other barriers that the law of God forbade. Only after this scrutiny could the marriage proceed, reinforcing the idea that matrimony was not a hidden act but a public covenant, bound to the watchful eye of both neighbours and clergy. For the clergy, a approval was not a formality but a duty. Priests were instructed to ensure that marriages were valid, that both bride and groom entered willingly, and that no forbidden ties of blood or kinship existed. In an age where family trees were tangled within small villages, these rules carried weight, preventing unions that the Church considered sinful. To marry without such oversight was to risk scandal, illegitimacy, or even excommunication, a punishment that carried shame heavy enough to darken a family's name for generations. Yet, Church control did not end with approval. Once a marriage was sealed, the Church laid down clear teachings about the duties of husband and wife. Husbands were instructed to lead with faith and provision, wives to obey with humility and care. Children born of the union were baptized swiftly, their legitimacy tied firmly to the sacrament of their parents' vows. In this way, the Church ensured that marriage was not merely a household arrangement, but a cornerstone of moral order, one that shaped the very fabric of Tudor society. For many couples, the ceremony itself was a moment of solemn wonder. Standing before the altar, they repeated words that countless generations had spoken, their hands joined, their futures bound. The flicker of candlelight, the scent of incense, the priest's steady voice, all lent the occasion an air of sacred permanence. Whatever hardships or joys awaited, the vows spoken within the Church framed marriage as unbreakable, a lifelong covenant witnessed by heaven. But the Church's authority could also bring burden. Those who sought to defy its rules faced heavy obstacles. A marriage across faiths, a union too hastily arranged, or a vow spoken without proper banns could all be challenged. Even kings were not immune. Henry VIII's desperate struggle to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon revealed how deeply Church approval governed the most personal decisions. His break from Rome, though rooted in politics, was also a testament to the power the Church held over the very bonds of marriage. For ordinary people, this control offered both comfort and constraint. Comfort because the Church's blessing gave stability, legitimacy, and a sense of divine protection. Constraint because love or necessity could never fully bypass the authority of priests and canon law. To marry in Tudor England was always, in some measure, to bow before the Church's power, and so, in quiet chapels and grand cathedrals alike, the Church's voice shaped every marriage. Its approval sanctified unions, its control set the boundaries of family life, and its presence lingered long after vows were spoken. In the steady rhythm of Tudor society, where kings and peasants alike lived under its shadow, the Church stood as both guardian and judge of matrimony, ensuring that every union served not only the household, but the faith that bound the age together. In Tudor England, no wedding felt complete without the presence of a priest. He stood not only as a witness, but as the voice of the Church, lending sacred weight to the promises spoken between bride and groom. The priest was more than an officiant. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, ensuring that what began as a human union was sealed as a divine covenant. Without his blessing, marriage was considered fragile, vulnerable, even questionable in the eyes of the community. With it, the bond carried the solemn authority of God himself. The priest's role began long before the couple stood at the altar. He was the one who announced the banns of marriage, reading aloud in church, for 3 Sundays the names of those who sought to wed. This public declaration gave space for any objections to rise, and it was the priest who received and judged them. If kinship was too close, or if a prior promise had been made elsewhere, he bore the duty of halting the match. In this way, he was a guardian of both morality and law, entrusted with protecting the sanctity of matrimony. On the day of the wedding, his presence framed every moment. The couple stood before him, their hands joined as he guided them through the vows. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried words that echoed through centuries, promises to love, to honour, to remain faithful in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want. For the bride and groom, nervous and hopeful, his voice lent clarity, shaping their whispered pledges into sacred vows recognised by the entire parish. The priest was also the keeper of ritual. He blessed the rings, symbol of unbroken unity. He led prayers for the couple's prosperity and the fruitfulness of their union. He read from Scripture, reminding all present that marriage was not only a private comfort, but a holy estate, modelled on the bond between Christ and the Church. Each gesture, each phrase carried both symbolism and permanence, weaving the marriage into the broader fabric of faith. For families and guests, the presence of a priest reassured them that this marriage was lawful and blessed. In an age where legitimacy meant inheritance, and inheritance meant survival, the priest's blessing ensured that children born of the union would be recognised as rightful heirs. His authority, therefore, reached beyond the ceremony, shaping the future of the family and the household. Yet the role of priests was not always purely ceremonial. They also acted as counsellors, guiding couples through disputes, reminding them of their vows, and urging reconciliation when tempers or hardships threatened to break peace. In the parish community, the priest was a figure of constancy, one who had likely baptised the bride and groom as infants, heard their confessions, and now joined their lives as one. His involvement was deeply personal, rooted in familiarity and trust. Still, there were moments of tension. Priests were bound by canon law, and at times their duty to the church clashed with the wishes of families. They could refuse to marry those who lacked proper consent, or those whose unions violated the rules of consanguinity. Such refusals sometimes stirred anger, for love and necessity did not always fit neatly within the church's boundaries. Yet the priest remained steadfast, for he was answerable not to passion but to doctrine. And so, in every corner of Tudor England, the priest's role in weddings carried a weight both symbolic and practical. He was the voice that sanctified promises, the guardian of law and morality, the counsellor who stood ready in times of need. He ensured that marriage was not merely a human arrangement, but a holy act, one that reached beyond the lives of two people into the eternal realm of faith. To understand marriage in Tudor England, one must also understand the ever-present language of sin. The Church did not speak of marriage only in gentle terms of companionship or in practical terms of property and alliance. It spoke too of marriage as a barrier, a shield set against the dangers of lust, desire, and moral failing. For many, the wedding vows were not only a promise of unity, but also a defence against the darker urges that, if left unchecked, could lead a soul into sin. Priests taught from the pulpit that marriage was God's answer to human frailty. Men and women were flesh, prone to longing, and in the eyes of the Church such longings were dangerous unless contained within holy matrimony. To take a partner outside the bounds of marriage was to stain not only one's own soul, but also the honour of the family and the peace of the community. The weight of this teaching hung heavy in every parish, a constant reminder that morality was not a private matter, but a public one. Within marriage itself, the Church urged moderation. Even in the bedchamber, love was not to become indulgence. Husbands and wives were told that their union must serve a higher purpose, the creation of children, the continuation of families, and the honouring of God's plan. Desire was permitted, but only in balance, never allowed to overtake reason or duty. In this way, morality reached deep into the most intimate corners of married life, guiding couples within visible but powerful boundaries. Adultery, above all, was considered a grievous sin. For men, it carried the shame of betraying both wife and God. For women, the consequences were even harsher, for questions of inheritance and legitimacy placed enormous weight upon their fidelity. A child born of doubt could unsettle the very fabric of inheritance, leading to disputes, dishonour, and scandal. Thus, the Church's teachings on sin were not only spiritual but deeply practical, shaping the trust upon which households and lineages depended. But the language of morality was not limited to faithfulness alone. Drunkenness, cruelty, or neglect within marriage were also condemned, though often with more leniency toward men than toward women. Wives were reminded to endure patiently, to pray for wayward husbands, and to find strength in obedience. Husbands were urged to rule their households with fairness, though the line between fairness and dominance was often blurred. In all cases, sin was cast as a poison that could seep into the home, weakening its stability and corroding its sanctity. Confession and repentance offered paths to healing, but the stain of scandal was not easily erased. Gossip was quick to travel, and moral failings within marriage often became the whispered talk of neighbours. A lapse of virtue could tarnish reputation for years, affecting children, families, and even the prospects of future marriages. In this way, morality was enforced not only by priests and scripture, but also by the ever-watchful eyes of the community. And yet, within this framework of caution and restraint, there was also tenderness. Couples who kept faith with one another, who honoured their vows and lived modestly, were praised as models of virtue. Their lives were seen as steady, their households blessed. For many, the pursuit of morality within marriage was not simply fear of sin, but a desire for harmony, a quiet hope that by living rightly, they might find both peace in the present and favour in eternity. In Tudor England, marriage was meant to last a lifetime. The vows spoken before the altar were binding not only in law, but in the eyes of God, and so the notion of divorce was shrouded in complexity, burdened with shame, and nearly impossible for ordinary people to achieve. For most couples, whether noble, merchant, or peasant, once the vows were spoken, there was no turning back. The Church held marriage as a sacrament, a holy bond that no human authority could break. To separate from a spouse was allowed in certain desperate cases, cruelty, desertion, or adultery. But even then, separation did not permit remarriage. At best, a couple might live apart, their union strained but still intact in the eyes of the Church. This was called a separation from bed and board, a phrase that allowed distance but denied freedom. They might no longer share a home, yet they were still bound together, unable to begin anew with another partner. True annulments were rare and difficult to secure. An annulment did not dissolve a valid marriage, but declared that the marriage had never truly existed in the first place. Reasons for annulment included close kinship never revealed, a lack of proper consent, or evidence that one partner had been incapable of fulfilling marital duties. Even then, the process was long, costly, and subject to strict oversight from church courts. For the wealthy, such petitions consumed time and treasure. For the poor, they were almost impossible to attempt. And yet, the struggles of kings remind us just how powerful and unyielding these barriers could be. Henry VIII's quest to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon revealed the iron grip of church law. His desire for annulment, not divorce as we know it today, but a declaration that the marriage had been invalid from the beginning, set him on a collision course with Rome. The Pope's refusal to grant what Henry sought led to England's break from the Catholic Church and the birth of the Church of England. It is a striking reminder that, in Tudor society, the difficulty of ending a marriage was so great that even a king was forced to reshape the religious order of a nation to achieve it. For ordinary men and women, there was no such power to command. A farmer bound to a wife he no longer loved, a merchant's daughter trapped in a cruel union. They could only endure, for the doors of freedom were all but closed to them. Divorce, in the modern sense, simply did not exist for most. Instead, they found themselves bound by vows that time and hardship could strain but never dissolve. This permanence carried both weight and stability. On one hand, it meant that marriages were undertaken with grave seriousness, for all knew there was little chance of escape. On the other, it meant that many endured sorrow, frustration, or even suffering within the bounds of wedlock, with no hope of release. The Church counselled patience, forgiveness, and endurance, urging couples to find strength in their vows no matter how heavy they became. And so the difficulty of divorce in Tudor England was not merely a matter of law, but a reflection of belief that marriage was a sacred, unbreakable bond intended to last until death itself offered release. The rare exceptions only highlight the rule, reminding us that for most, the path of marriage was one of endurance, with no turning back. In the early Tudor years, marriage was firmly under the Church's care. Priests announced the bans, bishops oversaw disputes, and canon law defined what was valid and what was forbidden. To marry without the Church's blessing was to risk scandal, illegitimacy, and even sin. In this way, the Church held not only spiritual authority but also immense influence over the lives of ordinary men and women. Yet the state, embodied in the king and his courts, also had an interest in marriage. For noble families, marriages carried questions of property, inheritance, and loyalty, all matters the crown could not ignore. For commoners, too, disputes over land and legitimacy sometimes reached secular courts, where the authority of law overlapped uneasily with the rulings of the Church. Still, for much of the 15th century, the Church remained the ultimate voice in matters of matrimony. This balance began to shift dramatically under Henry VIII. His desire to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon brought into sharp focus the Church's control over marriage laws. When the Pope refused his request for annulment, Henry challenged the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. What began as a personal struggle became a national turning point. By breaking from Rome and establishing the Church of England, Henry placed marital law directly under royal power. From that moment forward, marriage was no longer purely the domain of priests and bishops, but also of the crown and its courts. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared the king the supreme head of the Church of England, giving him ultimate authority in both religious and legal matters. This meant that marital disputes, annulments, and questions of legitimacy could now be decided not in Rome but within England itself. For the first time, the line between spiritual vows and state law blurred, as the Crown claimed the right to define what a lawful marriage was. This shift had far-reaching consequences. For the nobility, it meant that royal favour could determine the fate of unions, granting or denying legitimacy in ways that served political ends. For commoners, it meant that their marriages, though still guided by parish priests, ultimately rested within a system now reshaped by the Crown's authority. The Church still held influence, but it was no longer beyond the reach of the state. The tension between Church and state lingered throughout the Tudor era. Under Edward VI, Protestant reforms emphasised marriage as a social contract, as well as a holy bond. Under Mary I, a returned Catholic, authority brought attempts to restore the old order, once more placing marriage firmly in the hands of Rome. And under Elizabeth I, a steady Protestant settlement confirmed the Crown's dominance, ensuring that marriage would remain under English law rather than papal command. For ordinary people, these shifts were felt less as sudden upheavals than as quiet changes in the backdrop of life. Their weddings still took place in parish churches, with priests guiding vows and neighbours bearing witness. But the larger framework, who had the ultimate right to declare a marriage valid, who could dissolve it, and who controlled the laws that governed it, had moved into the hands of the Crown. In Tudor England, an annulment was not the same as a divorce. Divorce in the modern sense was almost unknown. An annulment, however, declared that a marriage had never truly existed, that some hidden flaw or forbidden circumstance had rendered it invalid from the beginning. For common folk, seeking such a judgment was nearly impossible, but for royalty, where every marriage carried the weight of kingdoms, annulments became a weapon, a way to reshape alliances, to secure heirs, and to bend personal desire into political necessity. The Church, for centuries, had been the sole authority in granting or denying annulments. Its courts examined claims of kinship too close, lack of proper consent, or inability to fulfill the duties of marriage. These reasons were rarely easy to prove, but for kings and queens, power could often press where truth alone might not suffice. Behind closed doors, papal dispensations, diplomatic favours, and whispered promises of alliance all shaped the outcome of such cases. The most famous example is, of course, Henry VIII. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon began as a union meant to strengthen ties between England and Spain. For nearly 20 years they lived as husband and wife, yet Catherine failed to give him a surviving male heir. As years passed and the Tudor line seemed ever more fragile, Henry's desperation grew. He sought an annulment, arguing that his marriage had been cursed from the start because Catherine had once been married to his brother Arthur. In the strict codes of canon law, such a union was indeed questionable, though a papal dispensation had been granted at the time. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry's frustration turned to defiance. His quest for annulment ultimately severed England from Rome, leading to the creation of the Church of England. What began as a personal plea became a national upheaval, showing the immense power that royal annulments could carry. It was not simply the fate of one marriage, but the fate of a kingdom's faith and governance that hung in the balance. Other Tudors, too, navigated this fraught path. Princess Mary, later Mary I, saw her legitimacy questioned as a result of her father's annulment from Catherine. The ripple of one royal annulment reached deep, into the lives of children, shaping succession and casting long shadows over futures. For royalty, annulments were never private matters. They were tools of power, and their consequences were carried not only by spouses, but by dynasties. To secure an annulment was no easy triumph, even for kings. Every petition was entangled with politics. Foreign powers watched closely, for the breaking of one marriage often meant the unravelling of alliances carefully woven over decades. A queen sent back to her homeland was not merely a woman set aside, but a symbol of rejection, an insult that could spark anger or even war. Thus, annulments were acts of high risk, wielded only when desperation outweighed diplomacy. For queens, the prospect was often cruel. Cast aside in favour of a younger bride or a more favourable match, they carried away the sorrow of broken vows, their reputations often stained despite their innocence. Catherine of Aragon, dignified and steadfast, refused to yield to Henry's demand, insisting until her death that she was his rightful wife. Her story reminds us that beneath the grandeur of politics, annulments left wounds that were deeply human, and so, in the Tudor world, annulments for royalty were never simply legal judgments. They were battles of power, faith, and personal desire, fought on a stage where all of Europe watched. They reshaped dynasties, altered the course of nations, and left behind echoes of both triumph and tragedy. For while ordinary couples remained bound to their vows until death, kings and queens found in annulments a dangerous key, one that could unlock freedom, but only at the cost of turmoil, scandal, and change that reached far beyond their own lives. In Tudor times, marriage was not simply the union of two hearts, nor even a contract of property and land. It was, above all, the foundation of a household. A husband and wife stepped into roles that were understood as ancient, ordained, and essential for the smooth running of life. These roles, though shaped by law and tradition, also carried the texture of daily routine. The fire tended in the hearth, the bread baked at dawn, the fields worked from sunrise until dusk. The husband, by custom and by law, was considered the head of the household. His duty was to provide, to labour in fields or trades, and to carry the family's honour in dealings with neighbours and courts. He was expected to lead not only with strength but with wisdom, guiding decisions about property, discipline, and alliances. Yet this leadership came with heavy responsibility, for the prosperity and survival of the home rested largely upon his shoulders. A failed harvest, a poor bargain, or the loss of work could cast the family into hardship. Thus, the role of husband was not one of ease, but of constant vigilance. The wife, though placed beneath her husband in authority, carried no less weight in her duties. She was mistress of the household, keeper of its rhythm and heart. From dawn, she might rise to spin wool, to oversee servants if the family could afford them, or to prepare food with her own hands if they could not. She managed the stores of grain, the preservation of meats, the brewing of ale, small but vital labours that ensured the family did not starve when winter came. Within the walls of the home, she was both organiser and caretaker, ensuring that the household remained steady even when the outside world grew uncertain. For children, too, roles were clearly marked. Sons were trained to follow their father's work, whether farming, trade, or apprenticeship in another craft. Daughters learned from their mothers the skills of cooking, weaving, and tending, all in preparation for their future households. Childhood was not a long season of play, but a gradual entry into the responsibilities that would define adult life. In this way, the household became not just a place of shelter, but a school where duty was taught and absorbed. Even in wealthier families, where servants eased the labour, the division of duties remained clear. A lady of the manor might not stir the pot herself, yet she oversaw the kitchens, kept accounts, and ensured the smooth working of an estate. Her role, though different in detail, echoed the same pattern. Husband as leader outward, wife as steward within. The Tudor ideal left little room for blurring these lines, though reality often softened them. In times of absence or illness, wives might manage farms or shops in their husband's stead, showing that duty could bend when survival demanded it. At the heart of these roles lay an understanding that marriage was less about companionship in the modern sense, and more about partnership in labour. A husband and wife were bound together not only by vows, but by the shared burden of survival. The fire that warmed them, the bread that fed them, the clothes upon their backs, all came from the careful weaving of their efforts. To neglect one's duty was to place the whole household at risk, and yet, within this structure, there was also tenderness. A wife's careful hand at the cradle, a husband's pride in his family's table, the laughter of children as they learned their tasks. These moments softened the weight of duty. The household was not only a system of labour, but also a circle of care, where roles, though demanding, gave meaning and order to life. Thus, in Tudor England, the story of marriage was lived out not only in laws and alliances, but in the steady rhythm of household roles. Each duty, whether great or small, became a thread in the fabric of family life, binding husbands, wives, and children together in a world where survival and honour alike began at the hearth. In Tudor England, the raising of children was seen less as a matter of personal choice, and more as a solemn duty. A household was considered incomplete without children, for they were the promise of continuity, the hands that would one day inherit the land or carry on the family's trade. To bring them into the world and to raise them with care and discipline was at the very heart of marriage. From the moment of birth, children were bound into the fabric of the household's work and worship. Baptism came swiftly, often within days, for infant mortality was high, and the salvation of the child's soul could not be left uncertain. Mothers bore the heavy burden of childbirth, often at great risk, while fathers stood as protectors, providers, and in many cases the moral guides of their offspring. Both roles were shaped by expectation, but both were softened by the shared hope that these fragile lives might thrive. Child-rearing was not simply a private act, but a communal one. Neighbours, godparents and kin all played a role, stepping in to support, to teach, or to discipline. Yet at the centre, the husband and wife stood as partners, bound together in the care of their children. The wife oversaw the daily nurture, feeding, clothing, teaching the first words and prayers. The husband shaped the path ahead, arranging apprenticeships for sons, seeking dowries or marriages for daughters. Their labours were different, yet entwined, each leaning upon the other to prepare their children for the world beyond the door. Discipline was considered essential, for Tudor society believed that children were born with wayward inclinations that must be guided firmly. Fathers often carried the role of authority, administering rules and sometimes punishment, while mothers softened these stern lessons with gentler instruction. In this balance, the household mirrored the wider expectations of society: firmness and nurture, order and care. To raise a child without discipline was seen as a failure not only to the family but to the community. Education too was a shared concern, though shaped by class and fortune. Sons of noble or wealthy families might be tutored in Latin, scripture and the arts of governance, while daughters were trained in manners, music and the management of a household. Among the lower classes, children learned skills directly from their parents: ploughing, weaving, cooking or trading. In every case, the lessons of childhood were woven tightly into the roles they were expected to play as adults. Parents, through their daily guidance, handed down not only knowledge but a sense of place and duty. Raising children together also meant enduring sorrow together. Infant mortality was harsh and ever-present. Many couples buried infants before they could walk, or watched sickness claim the young before they reached maturity. These losses weighed heavily upon marriages, yet they also bound couples in shared grief, reminding them of the fragile thread of life. To raise children was to live with both hope and fear, joy and mourning, woven so closely together that neither could be separated from the other. Still, within this demanding duty there was tenderness. A father teaching his son to handle a plough, a mother guiding her daughter's small hands at the loom, the quiet prayers whispered over sleeping children. These were moments of warmth that gave meaning to the labours of family life. Raising children together was not only about preparing them for the world, but also about cherishing the fleeting days of youth, knowing how swiftly they passed. Thus, in Tudor England, child-rearing was more than survival, more than discipline. It was the central bond of marriage, a shared task that gave husbands and wives purpose beyond themselves. Their household was not simply a structure of duty, but a circle of life, where each new child became both a burden and a blessing, a reminder that the future rested in their hands. For most families in Tudor England, marriage was a partnership built as much upon necessity as upon affection. The rhythms of survival required husband and wife to lean upon one another, each bringing their strength into the household economy. Life was fragile, and fortunes shifted quickly with the harvest, the weather, or the rise and fall of prices in the market. To endure these hardships, couples learned to cooperate, to share burdens, and to weave their daily labours together into a fragile net of security. The husband's work often carried him into the fields, the workshop or the marketplace. Farming families relied upon the uncertain cycles of the earth, where a late frost or a heavy rain could undo months of labour. Craftsmen and merchants too faced uncertainty, for a slow market or stiff competition might empty their purses. The wife's work, though often unseen by the wider world, was just as crucial. She spun thread, baked bread, brewed ale, tended animals, and stretched every coin as far as it could go. Her thrift could mean the difference between hunger and sufficiency, between a bare winter and one survived with dignity. When times grew hard, cooperation became the very soul of marriage. A wife might join her husband in the fields, bending beside him to plant or harvest. A husband might repair the cottage or barter his skill for extra food. Children too added their labour early, carrying water, minding animals, or helping at the loom. Each member of the family contributed, for survival was not the task of one but the duty of all. In this way, the household became a small economy of its own. Every hand necessary, every effort counted. Money troubles were common companions. Rent was owed to landlords, tithes to the church, taxes to the crown. A poor harvest could leave a family unable to pay, forcing them to borrow or to sell what little they had. Debts, once begun, could linger for years, casting shadows over marriages and fueling quiet anxieties that rarely lifted. Yet within this struggle, husbands and wives often drew closer, bound by the shared effort to keep their family afloat. In wealthier households, cooperation took a different form. Here, wives kept household accounts, managing servants and supplies, while husbands managed estates or businesses. Even behind the walls of manor houses, economic life depended on careful partnership. A misjudged expense, a failed investment, or a poorly arranged dowry could shake the family's position just as surely as a failed harvest might destroy a peasant's crop. For all levels of society, money was a thread woven tightly into marriage, demanding vigilance and balance. Amid struggle, there was also resilience. Families learned to barter, exchanging eggs for cloth, or labour for grain. Wives made remedies from herbs, stretching scarce resources when sickness struck. Husbands sought seasonal work, travelling for wages during planting or harvest time. These small acts of cooperation formed the hidden strength of marriages, enabling households to endure when times grew lean. And though survival often overshadowed comfort, there were moments of triumph too. A successful harvest, a debt finally repaid, a winter endured without want. These were victories that belonged to husband and wife alike. In such moments, their cooperation revealed itself not only as necessity, but as a bond of trust, a quiet assurance that together they could face whatever storms the world brought against them. Thus, in Tudor England, marriage was as much an economic partnership as it was a social or spiritual bond. Struggles with poverty, taxes, and uncertain harvests pressed upon every family, but through cooperation couples found strength. Their shared labour wove safety from scarcity, and their mutual endurance turned hardship into a bond as firm as any vow spoken before priest or crown. And so, our story drifts to a close. Tonight, beneath the theme of what marriage was really like in Tudor England, we've wandered through candlelit halls, through vows spoken in whispers and in duty, through the quiet struggles and the tender hopes of lives long gone. Thank you truly for keeping company with these voices from the past. Your presence here makes the telling feel alive, as if history itself leans closer to be heard. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. If your heart wishes, you may subscribe, so that the next story will be waiting softly at your side, but only if it feels right. There is no hurry here, only calm. And now let the day slip gently away, like snow settling on silent rooftops, like the last ember in a hearth sighing into darkness, like a candle's glow bowing out into the quiet night. Sleep well, dear dreamer, until next time.